How far back did the ketogenic carnivore diet go? Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm going to be discussing the optimal diet, which was developed by Dr. Jan Kwasniewski in the 1970s. Now, this was a ketogenic carnivore style diet, and the emphasis was on a high fat, low carbohydrate intake, which emphasizes high biological value foods, whole foods, so things like butter, lard, egg yolks, pork, meat, bone stocks, broth, things like that, meat in general, with a small amount of vegetation, but not a significant amount, mostly fermented foods. Now, this diet gained some popularity back in 1970, and it claims to be used by 2 million people worldwide, approximately 30 health clinics all over the globe, and about 300 doctors in Poland that actually practice this dietary protocol or approach based on its teachings. However, just for completeness, I will say this diet has not been, shall I say, documented in peer-reviewed medical literature or journals. It's more of a thing in kind of like the back street alleys, hidden kind of dietary realm, if that makes sense. Now, Dr. Kwasniewski's diet focuses on achieving ideal quantities and balance between proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. He is not the biggest proponent of consuming carbohydrates, but he basically added them in just to make it a bit more sustainable for people. So it's basically a ketovore diet. Now, the emphasis here is on including a moderate amount of carbohydrates, so not a significant amount at all. Usually 50 grams, perhaps even less. He actually prefers starchy carbohydrates over fruit and milk carbohydrates, which is quite interesting. Now, the implementation of this diet usually involves specific weight ratios between proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. And as the health status improves, people can start to alter those amounts. Generally speaking, the diet that they sort of suggest for optimal health is primarily protein and fats, which can be reduced gradually over time as someone's tolerability for different plant foods increases. So you might say this is quite similar to the dietary approach by Paleo Medicina, based in Hungary. Now, the daily food intake is typically organ meats, muscle meats, egg yolks, fatty cheeses, so we're talking about the hard cheeses here, low lactose cheeses, cream, marrow. They recommend fats such as butter, lard, and very specific oils, perhaps olive oil, or at least not seed oils anyway. The optimal diet recommends potatoes and vegetables as a main source of carbohydrates, but again, sparingly, just as an addition, as decoration to the diet itself. Now, what he also suggests, Dr. Kwasniewski, is that he doesn't recommend consuming more than 300 grams of vegetables daily. He believes this is unnecessary and deleterious to health outcomes. And additional salt, beyond salting to taste, is also discouraged. In some of Dr. Kwasniewski's books, religious and philosophical ideas are also presented. So he's quite a thought out kind of person. He's quite a logical thinker, I'd think. At least I'm guessing so anyway. Now, in his book, Homo Optimus, he claims that adhering to the optimal diet can lead to improved brain function and development of untapped human potential. Followers of this diet are believed to exhibit lower anxiety, increased peace, sense of well-being, high moral standards, and better health outcomes overall. They also apparently are less susceptible to be, shall I say, deceived by government, media, and other corporations. Now, to talk specifically about the macronutrient ratios that he's suggesting, what he is saying is basically this. The ratios between protein, fats, and carbohydrates are 1 gram to 3 grams to 0.8 grams. So, for example, that might look like 100 grams of protein to 300 grams of fat to 80 grams of carbohydrates. Still, it's a low carbohydrate diet. Now, I believe he recommends something like 1 gram per kilo of ideal body weight. So if your ideal body weight is perhaps, 70 kilos, then you're going to be consuming 70 grams of protein and then work out the diet from there. Now, this isn't based on body composition. It's more just for optimal health. Now, of course, being healthy requires you to have an optimal body composition. but it's not specific to build muscle or lose fat. It's just to get to what your body's kind of meant to be, evolutionary speaking anyway. Now, there are some issues that I have with this diet personally, just based on my experience, is that some people have to go much lower than, say, the 80 grams of carbohydrates in this diet. They might have to go down to 0 grams. This is particularly true if someone is dealing with diabetes or a pre-diabetic state. So obviously, diabetes is a disease where you have a carbohydrate intolerance, basically speaking. So the idea is to get as low as possible to get rid of the disease state as quickly as possible. Now, the protein gram amount is quite low in my opinion and my experience. For those of you that don't know, I typically recommend people to have between 1.5 and 2 grams of protein per kilo of lean body mass. So for most people, it's going to look like at least, I'd say, about 100 grams of protein at the bare minimum for nearly all people, except very, very small inactive people. Now, with that being said, the idea is just to get rid of any perhaps gut destroying proteins that might be existing. So what I'd actually suggest in this case, alternatively to Dr. Kwasniewski's recommendation, is to get rid of the foods that contain proteins which you're intolerant to. So typically this will mean dairy, perhaps some people egg whites or even eggs. Then you can work out from there. So I always suggest a kind of outwards in approach. So start off on a basic carnivore diet, transition slowly over 4 to 8 weeks, then refine it based on your goals and how you feel subjectively at that time. Now, what you'll also notice is his fat intake recommendations are very high. This is actually beyond what paleo medicine would typically recommend. So just to recap, it was 1 gram protein to 3 grams of fat to 0.8 grams of carbohydrates. So we're talking here someone on, say, 100 grams of protein, which will be high, assuming the 1 gram per kilo of ideal body weight. Not many people ideally want to be 100 kilos because it's 220 pounds. It's quite large for a lot of people, unless you're very tall like me. Then for them, having 300 grams of fat is going to be very high. So people do need to transition slowly. Otherwise, their gallbladder will not be able to kick out the right bile and deal with the food intake in that sort of quantity, that mass. So transition slowly. Now, what I might suggest to some people is to start at a value of 1 gram protein to 1 gram of fat, then work from there. So a lot of people will find, particularly if they're very active, will benefit from increasing the fat. Usually the protein's a pretty stable kind of amount to go by, but the fat is what the leverage is, if that makes sense. So you're looking at using fat as a lever to recomposition your body. I notice that oftentimes people go too low on the fat and they start to get dry skin, feel stressed out, the hormones aren't quite right, in which case increase the fat. Now remember, you don't have to necessarily be ripped out your mind to be healthy. My suggestion to a lot of people is about 10 to 20% body fat for males. For females, something like, 20 to 30%, 20 to 25% maybe. For females is an appropriate amount. Women will always have more fat, providing they're healthy, because they need more fat as a buffer for the period of time in which they fall pregnant or they become a mother, basically. That's quite helpful. So women will tend to have a higher fat ratio in my experience. That's not necessarily true for everyone, but I'd say it's generally the rule of thumb. Now, with that being said, I wouldn't suggest anyone really go below, say, 100 grams of protein and 100 grams of fat. And that's for both males and females overall, generally speaking. Now, you can use different practices. You can try this approach. Just be cautious that the fat intake will be very high. And if it's too high, you can actually prevent getting rid of things like diabetes. As there's too much influx of substrate in the body at one given time, that'll make it harder for your body to regain insulin sensitivity. So the idea isn't to have loads of fat, because that will block the insulin from working effectively, especially if you're following this kind of dietary intervention and your carbohydrates are still in place, if that makes sense. So be very cautious not to go too high in the fat. Some people do benefit though. It does seem to allow you to make more use of the protein and spares the protein. This is basically a classical ketogenic diet with some vegetation sprinkled in. So hopefully that's been useful to you guys. It just gives you guys a different picture about what diets are out there right now, what's been around the block at the time. I imagine Dr. Kwasniewski got some of his ideas from the Inuit population. Perhaps some other influencers around this sort of area have done the same. But it seems to work. They seem to have been getting good practices, good results. So yeah, if you like this video, leave a like, comment, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys next time. Thank you. Build muscle and lose fat on the carnivore diet.